trying to figure out what happened to our world from about the year 1500 to the year 1900. There's a few reasons if we're going to be doing this. First one is just to get a sense of history. I've been thinking about what Damaris, our last guide, said to us in Clint Smith's book, that history is no longer taught, or when it's taught incorrectly. Now, we do have some very excellent historians here at Hartwick, who are, I think, teaching some good history, but no, not all of us are taking those classes. Bless you. PJ, you said that this chapter was like what you should have learned in high school. I think so too. I would have really liked this chapter in high school, you know. In fact, that's one of the reasons we're going to be doing it. So when Damaris says that it's taught incorrectly, I want to have a couple other comments from Smith in this chapter on the Whitney Plantation. He talks about how oftentimes when we tell these stories, we actually, like when we tell the story of the enslaved people, we concentrate on the people who got out. Frederick Douglass, for example, who was an incredible person, but there were other incredible people who were not able to escape. And Smith talks about how when he was in high school, he would get mad at people for not resisting or not escaping, like Harriet Tubman and Harriet Jacobs, the people we hear about. But in fact, that was really difficult to do. It was very difficult to get out. Some people were too far deep into the system or had reasons that they needed to stay, including family members, children, parents. So, you know, we have to realize that, yeah, there were lots of incredible individuals who found themselves in some terrible circumstances. It's amazing what people were able to do, but we shouldn't only focus on the few and act like anybody could have done that. There's another myth, Shaylin, that we grow up with, or we used to grow up with, about what the plantations were like. Wow, what do the visitors often, the white visitors often ask the Whitney guides? Or what do they think about the plantations?
That they're admiring their like infrastructure and like, and they assume that they assume that they were like treated, the slaves were like treated well by they're like, oh yes, at this plantation they were actually, the slaves were treated nice.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, this is you know, the idea that in some ways it wasn't so bad, or that some owners were good and they were nice. And, you know, our guide is like, yeah, sure, some people maybe gave more food out than others, but it's like, you know, you kidnapped my kid, but at least you fed them well. That doesn't work. But there's a whole mythology in the United States that somehow slavery was some kind of benevolent institution which helped to educate people and give them skills. In fact, we just had a debate about this. If you were reading the news in Florida, their educational system had a little paragraph about, you know, how people earned, you know, got skills from slavery and then went on to other things. And, you know, how to say, it's actually still a live issue in our politics. Now, of course, people learn things, but as Smith also points out here, people were reliant on the skills of the enslaved, who were actually had agricultural practices and things that they brought with them from West Africa that they were able to use in places like Louisiana. So if anything, the enslaved persons were often teaching people how to cultivate the land and do those kinds of things. We also have, on the other side of it, though, is something that our guides talk about, which is that some people only want to learn about the brutality. They only want to learn how bad it was. Did you tell them how bad it was? Did you tell them this? Did you tell them that? And the guides say that this is also a kind of trap, because it completely takes away any sense in which the enslaved persons could themselves have desires, feelings, being able to maneuver, have contributed in any way. And, in a later passage, they talk about the music and the cultural contributions. And it's certainly true that without the contributions of enslaved Africans and the Delta blues tradition, there'd be no rock and roll. There'd be no American music tradition really at all. And so we can't only think in terms of brutality, because it takes away from what people were actually, in some instances, able to do. So it's very difficult to maneuver among these perspectives when we're telling the stories of history, because it's tempting to fall into one or the other of these. I will say that when we're going to be talking a lot about colonialism in the European colonization of much of the world, and these very same ideas come up. So on the one hand, people only want to celebrate the heroes or the resistors to colonialism. There's the benevolent colonizer myth, that is, that they came in and helped to develop or modernize places that they saw as underdeveloped or backward. And there's also the people who only want to talk about the evils, and in some ways erase the fact that there were all kinds of people who were indigenous or involved in this, who were also trying to transform their lives in different ways. So that's the first reason we're doing this. The second reason has to do with the fact that this is an anthropology class, a second level anthropology class. And it's hard for anthropology, it's hard to make sense of what the discipline of anthropology was without knowing what happened during this time. So Elvis, you talked a little bit about this. What happened during this time that left marks on anthropology?
I was talking about the Industrial Revolution, and how Industrial Revolution and colonialism, capitalism,
Absolutely. So if in some ways we've learned that, anthropology is not really an academic discipline until around 100 years ago, until around 1900, let us say, and then you have Franz Boas and other people that we talked about. In some ways, they were looking for these untouched, non-Western others, but they never really, they wanted to find these people who were outside of Western colonialism. But it's important to understand that anthropologists were never actually studying these isolated, backward primitives, but people who had been already for hundreds of years either transformed or displaced or changed by the colonial experience and these kinds of things. Also during this period arise many of the ideas and stereotypes that we still swim in today, and that anthropology eventually wanted to argue against or fight from this period in time. So we talked before about the idea that people come in races, that there are 4 or 5 or 3, 4, 5, 7 races in the world, and that determines your outlook on life and your behavior. The very idea that people are modern, there has something called modern people, or people that are on a different timeline, that people are on some kind of timeline, those emerge during this period. And like I said, there's something that anthropologists would eventually argue against, but they're the stereotypes about people that arise during this period. So that's important to me, to some of you who might be anthropology majors, but many of you don't care about that, and that's okay. I think most importantly for understanding this history and why we should get it at least by high school, maybe elementary school, is that it explains how we are in this classroom now. I mean, how we have a college named after a person named Hartwick, who appropriated, let's say, privatized indigenous land, and somehow we are here, and some of you are coming in with ancestry in the Caribbean, some of you are coming in with ancestry in Africa, some of you are coming in with ancestry in Southern and Eastern Europe. This all happened during this time. And the fact that, you have somebody with a last name from Italy, Southern Europe, teaching a class in this place on a hill that was once traversed by indigenous people, it could not be explained without this time period. I sometimes play this song, which I'd recommend playing on YouTube. You can click the link, by the historian Bob Marley, who talked to us about the Buffalo Soldier. Marley said that if you know your history, then you would know where you're coming from, which is important, right? We want to know our history so we know where you're coming from. But actually, in some ways, like his second line better. Then you wouldn't have to ask me, who the heck do I think I am? Which I think is to say, if you know about history, you know where you're coming from, but you also know why people got moved around and put into different places, and you don't have to show up somewhere, let's say in New Mexico, and wonder why certain people are there. There's a historical process behind that. The Buffalo Soldiers are a good example. You may know those folks. Oh, maybe we should do that history. Maybe we'll do that. We'll do that later. We don't have time in this class, but if nobody knows, I thought somebody might know. The Buffalo Soldiers were regiments of African Americans who were called up by the United States. They served mostly after the Civil War, and they were basically the premier troops who were going west and subduing and clearing out the land, let us say, so that settlement could occur in the West. And so they were stationed throughout the West. They were fearsome fighters, some of the best infantry, cavalry fighters that you could have. And they have been often erased from our history. They were not recognized. People don't associate, for example, the West, going into the west of the United States and the Great Plains, and even as far north as Montana and places like that, with Black soldiers, but in fact, they were there. And they were the ones who were, in some ways, they have now been recognized for their valor and bravery and contribution to this. Of course, there's this tiny bit of contradiction here that their nickname apparently was given to them by the Native American or indigenous people who they were fighting against, who they were trying to make sure were getting pushed out in advance of other settlers. So history is very complicated, right? I mean, do we celebrate that? Because talk about some intersectionality there, right? You have class, gender, race, ethnicity all blending together. I think it's important to recognize that people get caught up in these kinds of contradictory movements. We might have to talk about them someday. Anyway, Marley's song is a good starting point for them. All right. Today we're talking about anthropology and economy. And to preface our study of world history from 1500, we learn and guessed about several kinds of different, what we might call economic systems. Things that we learn about in anthropology as being economic, but you will probably never hear about in your economics class, because economics only studies things that have capitalism and the market economy. Anthropology tends to take a wider view. So we look at things, what Guest calls foraging. I prefer the term gathering and hunting, but horticulture or small scale planting, pastoralism or herding animals, and agriculture. And these are different ways in which people have interacted with their environment and found ways to get subsistence. I think that it's just important to point out that all of these things have flourished at various times, and sometimes they fade away and they change, and people that are hunting and gathering even today are not the same as they would have been hundreds or thousands of years ago, and there still are people who are hunting and gathering. But it's important to realize that all of these systems and ways of making a living have come and gone, and they've all been in interaction and trading with each other. And so, as Guest points out a little later in the chapter, that the story of the development of our world economy is not that these different groups were in isolation from each other, but that they were connected and trading and interacting with each other all along the way. But the idea here is that you can actually have a society in which these are the main modes of moving things around and exchanging things. Now, in some societies, the predominant form of exchange grew to be one that we know more of as market, in which things are starting to move around and be traded, but you need to have some form of currency in order to trade them. Now, in a book called Questioning Collapse, it was written by some archaeologists a little bit ago, they talk about if you went back in time and surveyed the most powerful and largest cities in the world. So we've been talking about societies that might be based on small scale horticulture or hunting and gathering. They're talking about dynamic trading centers. And they go back and they say, well, around 1500 years ago or 500 AD, Common Era, whatever you want to say, the most powerful and largest cities in the world were in what is now Mexico, what is now Italy, and what is now China. And then they say, if we go forward another 500 years or about 1,000 years ago, the most powerful cities would be found in Peru, what is now Peru, in Iraq, and Central Asia. And if we go about 500 years ago, the most powerful cities would be again in China, and in India, and in Turkey. Now, there are really cool things happening in the Americas, in what is now the Inca, or what was the Inca Empire, and what was the Aztec Empire. And they had lots of cool different ways to trade things around there, but they were not interconnected. And so they were cool in their own way. But across this region, there was more interconnection and trade and a market economy known as the Silk Road, and trading things like spices and metals and all kinds of goods all the way along here, creating some very dynamic and powerful cities. Now, you might notice that there's some places that we consider to be powerful today that are just not even on this map at all. And as Guest says, that for much of the time up until about 500 years ago, Europe wasn't really involved in this. I mean, they wanted to be involved, but they weren't seen as a central player to this. Nobody wanted to live in what is now London. That would have been way in some sort of backwater place. You didn't want to be there. You wanted to be in these much more vibrant things, and that's where the Europeans wanted to be. Guest gives us a couple examples of people who traveled around this world. Like, we all know about Marco Polo, but he's actually only the third most traveled person in this time period. But first, the winner is Ibn Battuta, who made all these voyages and traveled about, I don't know, 70,000 miles or so, 3 times as far as Marco Polo ever went. Now, there's some debate about some of the things he did out here, if that was real or not, but he made it pretty far. You'll notice he didn't ever want to go up to London or any of those places. That would be dumb. Just travel around the truly civilized world. Then another surprise. Right, PJ? I hadn't heard about this person. Yeah. Here's a Chinese naval officer who sails all around twice as far as Marco Polo, way before Columbus ever did anything. There he is, 1405 to 1435, sailing all around there. What is, bringing lots of big boats and stuff. So, at the time, about 500 years ago, one of the most powerful and dynamic places to be was in the Islamic Empire. And this is the Islamic Empire at its greatest extent, which extended from what is almost India all the way up to, they made it up to the Pyrenees in southern France, where they got stopped. Bless. The Islamic Empire was a place of great learning. They had preserved and were working on some of those Greek texts, had some of the best libraries in the world, also some of the best achievements in mathematics. It's difficult to think about where mathematics would be without Arabic numerals. Trying to do any sort of math with Roman numerals is not the best thing to do. So you need those Arabic numerals. They also developed cultivation of sugarcane throughout this area. They had these very sophisticated trade routes, but the Europeans found themselves getting cut off from those. So there were these overland trade routes the Europeans, the people in Europe wanted access to, and they needed to get there, but they couldn't because they were getting cut off. So this is the Iberian Peninsula in 1491, which is this where Portugal and Spain are today, is what it would have been like. If you lived in this area in 1491, what's the most important thing that's going to happen to you in 1492? Yes. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. When do we celebrate Columbus Day? Sometime in October of 1492, which means that Columbus was stumbling around the Caribbean at the time, not knowing where he was. And he certainly hadn't sent any word back to Spain because he didn't have Twitter. So he couldn't advise them of what he was doing. Nah, the most important thing that happened in the Iberian Peninsula in 1492 was the fall of the Kingdom of Granada, which was the last Muslim caliphate in this peninsula. Up until that time, Spain, what is now Spain, had basically been ruled by Islam, by the Muslims. They give us words like ojalá, may Allah grant that. This is sort of the Spanish word, or the word for sugar, azúcar, actually comes from the Arabic, right? So in this way, though, with the fall of Granada, the people completed what was later termed the reconquista, the reconquest of what they believed was their land, their territory, and the Muslims were expelled from Europe. In the same year is when Spain also began the Spanish Inquisition and expelled the Jews, or said you must convert or leave. And so it's a crucial time for when we have this emergence of what we might call a newly militarized or militant Christianity, and a declaration that we are going to be Christian here in what was before a very multi-ethnic and multi-religious society. And so we have this interesting expansion from there, from these two tiny places in Europe end up setting up two of the largest empires in the world. Places that before then had not really been a big deal. So the Portuguese were actually one of the first to start sailing around the coast of Africa, looking for a way to get in by water to the to Asia. They didn't know about the Americas. Columbus, of course, sailed under the Spanish crown, but he wanted to sail for the Portuguese. That's who he wanted to be with, because the Portuguese knew this stuff much better than the Spaniards did. And so he kept begging the Portuguese to let him try. He said, I know I can get there if I just go west. I can get to Asia by going west and go around the world. You know why the Portuguese didn't give Columbus the money he wanted to go west? Yeah.
Was it because they'd already gotten there by going around Africa?
One of the reasons is they were getting close. They knew that they were getting close this way. They felt like they didn't need to try that. Although the Portuguese were sailing west. And in fact, it's estimated that if it hadn't been Columbus, that another Portuguese or Spanish sailor would have stumbled on the Americas in 10 to 15 years. They didn't fund Columbus because Columbus had this weird idea that the world was smaller than it was. And so he calculated that he could get to Asia faster than you actually could. The Portuguese knew the world was bigger. They knew actually basically how big the world was, and so they didn't want to fund Columbus because they knew he'd never make it. Now, of course, neither of them knew they'd run into a whole nother continent, but that was why this happened. The Portuguese, I dwell a bit on the Portuguese because they're kind of an underknown, they're so important for the way the world turned out, but people don't know that much about them. They've kind of forgotten, and they're a little tiny country now. We forget how important they were. So on Wikipedia, you can read about the capture of Ceuta, which is this city that is basically in what is now Morocco, but it's on the coast in the Mediterranean. The Portuguese captured it. Interestingly, now it's a Spanish city, although it's surrounded by Morocco. So one of those things. But yeah, they had this amazing influence. They probably, you know, as we'll talk about, transported and the largest importation of enslaved Africans into Brazil, and lasted until the handover of Portuguese Macau to China in 1999, which is just incredible. And for those of you who follow, say, Brazilian politics, and we're kind of amazed that someone named Bolsonaro, known as the Trump of the tropics, someone so reactionary and so, how to say, almost probably saying things that are more white supremacists than even our own politicians. How would that happen in a place like Brazil? It might make more sense if you consider that how Brazil was part of this large-scale Portuguese empire at its beginnings. So we see, though, that from these two countries, the Spanish, of course, with Christopher Columbus, and then later explorers taking over almost all of what is North America, almost all of what is South America, the exception of Brazil, and many other parts of the world, including the Philippines, many islands here, parts of India and Africa, really transform the world. These two little places in Europe, which had up until that time not been really on the main stage of the world. Again, they had a newly militarized Christian ethic, which stemmed from their Reconquista and their ideas that they were fighting fighting a religious battle against Islam, against the Muslims, which would then get interpreted into the Americas. And so they went on a missionizing touch. And basically what this did is it put Europeans into contact with a much wider range of societies and peoples than they had really ever encountered before. There were no anthropologists, though. There was no one to really study this. This was just people going in and basically trying to conquer or enslave or take things away, missionize. There wasn't a lot of study going on. It probably would have been nice to have some people who did a bit more study during that time, but this was the time that people began to start to think about human differences on a much larger scale. Now, the Spanish, because they found this land, of course, were looking for gold at first, got a bunch of gold from the Aztecs and a bunch of gold from the Incas, but then they basically ran out of gold, but they would find something that was even more important, which is a huge hill of silver, and was what is now Bolivia in Potosí. Guest talks about this on page 416 about how the silver from Peru, I guess it would have been called Peru at the time, caused the amount of silver in the world to rise by 8-fold. And so through this exploitation of the silver, the Europeans were able to buy their way into this trading system. Potosí is a place that today, well, let me talk about what it was back in the day. This is a painting of Potosí by one of its most famous artists in 1758, back when there was pretty much nothing going on in what would become the United States. You can see already they have a laid out grid system. This was a city that was larger than London at its time. It was larger than Paris. It was a place that everybody knew about. The historian who wrote that book calls it the first global city, because people from all over the world were coming there for the silver and the riches. Brian, you would have known about that. If you go there today, you can still see the architecture from various places in Spain, not just the Spanish, but different people that got expelled from Spain, Jews, Muslims, they were all there. The Spanish believed that this hill was what gave them entree or dominion over, or an ability to conquer the rest of the world. So there's the Virgin Mary superimposed, or as if she were part of the silver mine. If you go there and you go to the mint, they make a pretty strong case that our symbol for the dollar sign that we use on our currency is actually derived from the stamp of the Potosí mint. That in fact, the peso, the Spanish peso, was the precursor for the dollar. Now, there's other evidence for this. When the United States first put out its currency, the dollar, it wasn't very well accepted because people didn't believe in the credit of the United States. And so they said, well, if you have this dollar, we will give you 1 silver Spanish peso. And so the dollar was originally based on, or got its value from, the silver peso. There's also the fact that probably would be your great grandparents would talk about things like 2 bits and 4 bits as corresponding to a quarter or 50 cents, because it was the same as cutting a peso into different amounts. So we have this transformation of the world brought about by the silver mines of Peru, and silver coming in from Mexico as well. And the Europeans were able to buy their way into these trading networks. After that, and with the assistance of some of this money, we see Europeans start to get super involved in enslaving and bringing over people, mostly from West Africa, into the Americas. I've showed you this before. This is kind of a rough estimate of how many people went where. In numeric form, again, rough estimate. Brazil, the largest destination for enslaved Africans. The Spanish got involved in this a little bit later. They actually didn't do it at the beginning, mostly into Cuba. What is known as the British West Indies. That would have been the British Caribbean, so islands like Jamaica, Barbados, a couple million. The French West Indies, so a place like Saint-Domingue, quite high. You'll notice that British North America was not that much. It was not a super huge destination for enslaved Africans. In fact, it's about as much as some places that we don't even know about, like the Dutch West Indies, including Suriname, what is in South America, who imported as many. And so, as we've talked about, most of the people who were brought in were brought to work on sugarcane plantations. And Saint-Domingue was one of the richest and most profitable places. This French colony, which was an amazingly profitable and an amazingly deadly place for the enslaved Africans at the time. I think I may have shown you this too. In some ways, the plantation system was not just about exporting the crops, it also transformed these crops into something that then could be sent into either molasses or sugar itself. And so many people believed that the plantations of the 18th century, so before the Industrial Revolution, actually were provided a kind of template for the factory organization that Europeans would impose later upon their own people. So, PJ wasn't here for the first class when we did talk about Haiti, but that's okay, but we'll talk about it again. Saint-Domingue is where we have the first and perhaps only successful revolution of enslaved people. It becomes, Haiti is the second independent country in the Americas after the United States. So it's the second independent country, and as Smith tells us, it is the first Black-led republic in the world. Today, the situation is enormously sad and chaotic, in which was once this enormously profitable and enormously politically important place. Not just that, it's crucial to US history, because as Smith tells us, without the Haitian Revolution, there's no way Napoleon would have been willing to sell all that land so cheaply. He would have at least argued for a lot more money. And as you may remember from your history classes, Jefferson, he was only interested in getting a hold of New Orleans. He really didn't want all that land. He thought it was a bad idea. But Napoleon wanted to sell it because he wanted to fund his wars in Europe. And once he had lost Haiti, he figured that big plot of land really wasn't worth it to him. Now, I think we've talked about how the Haitian Revolution is enormously important for the history of the United States, in the way in which the US was able to expand. never gave him credit for it. And as Smith tells us, it also hangs over the South and the plantation system, the idea that Black people might be able to govern themselves, that they might be able to revolt and to rise up. If you lived in this area of the world, that was something that was on your mind. Now, in Louisiana, which is where we're reading about today in the Whitney Plantation, is one of the areas of the United States, what is now the United States, which in some ways the enslavement might have looked more like what happened in the Caribbean or in Brazil. PJ, what do you notice about the number of people here in Louisiana?
60% on
Yeah. Yeah, so we have larger numbers of enslaved persons here than elsewhere in the United States. So those ratios would have probably been more like what was going on in some of these societies, still less, but getting there. And so it was a larger number. And also, as you noticed, that there was like a massive armed rebellion there, which is another thing that disappears from our history books. But you know, it was in some ways modeled upon the Haitian Revolution, but also was their own thing. And so this is one way in which this area of Louisiana was probably more consistent with what happened on plantations elsewhere in the Americas. Also, although they didn't always grow sugar, they started to really grow a lot more sugar. If you look at the sugar plantations of Brazil or Saint-Domingue or even Jamaica, sugar was really the biggest killer of enslaved workers. The people who were brought in to work on these plantations, it's said that they averaged about 7 years. And so in these places, you know, I don't want to be crass about this, but the owners were basically using them as human machines. And they were sort of calculated in the cost of operating the system and sort of profits and losses. Now, in the United States, something kind of unique happens, or it seems to be unique, which is something else that we don't know about. Tiana, you talked about this person's what he calls discovered ignorance, what he didn't know about, what he never knew about. What did he never know?
He never knew that the history of the plantation that he bought, or very much like the truth of like how damaging slavery was in this country.
Yeah. And he never knew the history of the place that he bought. And as he was reading through these stories, what was the one thing that got to him? The one job or the one description they had of people that he just was like, I can't turn this into a tourist trap anymore. Yeah.
Wasn't it about female slaves and the ones who were deemed good breeders to reproduce and create more labor?
That some women were called a good breeder, that they were. In the chapter that we didn't read, Smith talks about that in the United States is perhaps the only example of a society in which slavery was practiced and that the enslaved population increased through reproduction. Now, that's not to say that there weren't a lot of Africans and a lot of descendant Africans in Brazil and the Caribbean, but they didn't seem to be able to, they didn't grow the enslaved population. And so in Louisiana, even after the transatlantic slave trade was made illegal, the number of people in enslavement actually went way up over the next 40 or 50 years, which is I mean, it does make it more. And it's not that slavery wasn't important in many places, but the fact that this was so intimately connected into the domestic sphere of of trying to reproduce and enslaving in many cases, planters would enslave their own children from these offspring is pretty intense. What's that, Kat?
Those are the statues of like enslaved children that the artist put in the church that donated its land to the plantation.
Yeah, that's pretty. I thought this was pretty powerful stuff, right? Talking about the enslavement of children and how they were made to work, bought, sold, separated, family separation. Yeah, pretty intense. All right, so before there was ever any anthropologists, before anybody ever thought about studying other people, it's important to remember that the whole world had been reshaped, the New World and the Old World, the Americas and Africa and Eurasia, in part because of the silver mines and the things that were able to be traded around, and also how the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, Brazil, you might call the Greater Caribbean, Louisiana, take this thing that was once this exotic, high-priced commodity, azúcar, into something that everybody needs, that the English were loading up into their tea, and the French were loading up into their coffee, and the Swiss eventually figured out how to combine it with cacao to give us chocolate. Now, it's hard to imagine how there could have been the Industrial Revolution that we all learn about in Europe and the Americas without being fed these increased sugar calories into your drinks, caffeinated beverages, tobacco. That was another good one to have if you're a worker. It's hard to imagine how that could have happened without these resources being fed into the system. But in many ways, once the Europeans and the Americans industrialized and got these factories going, the importance of these earlier episodes have been forgotten. Nobody except Amy knew where Potosí was. Never heard of it before. It's this forgotten city on the 4,000 meters up in the Andes that nobody knows about. Nobody knows about what happened in Haiti and the importance of the Haitian Revolution. And so we've erased a lot of these things from our memories. In the process, the world became arranged as this hierarchy of races. We've talked about this before. Smith talks about it too, how racism is what produces race. And it's this productive system of trying to put people into places and make people work for others, make people do things for other people, which sets up this racial hierarchy, which then becomes the reason why, or becomes a justification, an explanation and a justification for the very system that it had created. And so going back to our idea of why anthropology got so excited about the concept of culture, it was in part what anthropology was fighting against eventually, is this very hierarchized world in which your racial assignment had a lot to do with the amount of power you would have in any of these places. And so before any anthropologists ever got on the scene, there were all of these stereotypes about people that we might consider indigenous or African. Part of those stereotypes had been brought about by the very system in which they were involved. So, there was a traveler, kind of like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, and he was traveling around the world. In the 1830s, he showed up in Tierra del Fuego, which is the southernmost part of Argentina. And he was met by some of the native inhabitants there who had probably, by that time, been in some ways terrorized and decimated by Spanish colonialism. But this is the way he described the people in Tierra del Fuego. He said, the language of these people, according to our notions, scarcely deserves to be called articulate. Basically saying they don't have language, can't talk. By the way, many of you may know that the whole idea of being articulate has often been levied in a racialized way. But here it is. No reason to believe they have any religion. They have no government or chief. They cannot know the feeling of having a home, and still less that of domestic affection. Their skill in some respects may be compared to the instinct of animals, for it is not improved by experience. They're just running around hunting and gathering. And in the old days, we thought that hunters and gatherers were like wild. They were wild like the wild animals that they were chasing. And there it is. Any idea who might have penned these words? Yeah. Oh, no. Getting close though.
Asshole?
An asshole. This does sound very mean, doesn't it? It doesn't sound very. Doesn't sound like somebody who should be making scientific observations. Yeah.
Oh, it's Darwin?
This is Darwin. Our hero. The hero of Johnstone. And I don't want to be down on Darwin. Darwin is just telegraphing the thoughts of people at his time. But you have to admit that, in some ways, these are all the stereotypes that anthropologists eventually tried to argue against. For example, when you read the chapter about language, if Darwin or others say they don't even have a language, what are you supposed to say? When we watch the film about language, what are you supposed to say back to that?
I wish you didn't.
Well, I know we can be mean, but we're supposed to be nice about it. If we're being nice about language, what do we say about other people's languages? Yes.
There's different forms of it.
There's different forms. You can't rank these languages. They have languages, and you can do different things with them, like South, like being able to navigate, and they're all different. They definitely have language. We haven't read about religion yet, but you can guess that the anthropologists are going to be saying that, hey, people in all kinds of different societies have valid religious beliefs. We haven't read about politics yet, but you can bet anthropology is going to be saying that, no, they have their own forms of political organization. You may not have these centralized governments, but we're going to be talking about different ways to do politics. Wait, we did do kinship and family. What should we say about that? Back to Darwin. What do you learn about kinship? Yeah. It's not as straightforward as it used to be made out to be, but we can also know that they had complex kinship systems, right? They didn't have the feeling of having a home and domestic affection. And in fact, in some ways, their kinship system is more complex than ours is. And of course, this chapter is all about the idea of an economy and how all societies have different ways of using their land and resources, and that you can't just say that people are like animals, that in fact the economy, what anthropologists consider the economy, is a cultural adaptation to the environment that enables us to thrive on a given piece of land, no matter if you're hunting and gathering or herding or doing these kinds of things. So again, I mentioned this because in some ways the stereotypes of the 19th century about others were formed during this period of colonialism, in which people were terrorized and brutalized. But at the same time, people were creative and transformative in their own worlds, and continued and persisted and resisted and did different interesting things. And so we should be able to talk back to the ideas of Darwin and others at the time using our anthropology. Now, I want to get a little bit into the last part of this chapter, which a couple of you talked about, and the idea of modernization. So I talked about how the whole idea of what it meant to be modern, of the Industrial Revolution, comes to us from this time period. So in some ways, I hope we've learned that a lot of the things that went into the Industrial Revolution happened in the Americas and in the colonies. The mines, silver mines, mines of other products, plantations, produced the stuff that went into fueling, quite literally, the Industrial Revolution. However, those places, or those activities, left a lot of the places like Brazil, Haiti, many of the Caribbean islands worse off than they were before. I will also add, we didn't talk about it as much, that one of the things the Industrial Revolution did is to copy the designs and the trade of what was going on in India, where they had a humongous textile production. And basically the British tried to destroy Indian textile production so they could do it at home. So in a lot of ways, what happened in Europe and what we call the Industrial Revolution was built on extraction from the colonies. After that happened, though, comes this idea that everyone should do the same thing, that we should all industrialize and modernize and build up our economy in the same way the Europeans have. Now, on the one hand, this comes to us from the capitalist idea of everybody becoming an industrial capitalist, but I want to also mention that communism, as it was practiced in the Soviet Union and by Lenin interpreting Marx, it wasn't anti-industrialist. In fact, Marx believed that the bourgeoisie had brought the biggest and best transformation that the world had ever seen. And what he wanted to do was appropriate that so he could make even bigger factories, even larger. He wanted to, the claim was when Lenin was taking over the Soviet Union, that with the 5-year plan, they'd be able to outproduce the capitalists, that they'd make even more stuff. And so both capitalism and communism concentrated on this idea of industrialization. And they also, especially after World War II and the independence of places like India, there was this belief that all these newly independent countries had to simply get on this track of development and industrialize themselves. Now, as you may know, this didn't quite work out. Tiana, what did in something that developed probably in the 1960s, the idea that, yeah, things are not just, it's not like the colonizers leave and everything can be better again, that people are involved in these global systems and that they start to play out, perhaps under new management, you might say, but to start to continue to play this role of exporter of raw materials into the global economy, or that their agricultural lands in some places have been so damaged by sugar plantations and production that they're difficult to transform into something else. Guest here brings up the idea that there are certain core countries, certain countries that are on the periphery, and that how these feed into each other, which is another aspect of this idea. I would say, in agreement with Tiana, that this is actually a very important perspective because it gives us more of a sense of some of the historical relationships. And as a kind of broad brush explanation for the world, it's worth thinking about at least. But it doesn't give us everything we need to know. And what in some ways it doesn't explain is how places that were once rural and considered periphery, like Japan or South Korea, how did they become these industrial powerhouses, big giants on the world scene? Or the rise of, in today's world, China or India or Brazil, which means we have to think about this in a more multipolar way. Yeah.